Cyber-physical attack methods do not differ wildly to any kind of cyber attack method. So a denial of service is a denial of service, regardless of whether it has as impact physical or cyber, or at least as target physical impact or cyber impact. Nevertheless, it's a useful exercise to try to see all the different types of attack methods that have been used for cyber-physical attacks with the purpose of having a physical impact. And we can use the classification of CIA for the cyber impact, so confidentiality breach, integrity or availability breach. And for the physical impact, we can go for physical privacy, unauthorized actuation, incorrect actuation, delayed actuation, or altogether prevented actuation as the different types of impact. So we can use this as a way to classify the different attack methods. Now, one attack that is used, especially in any network that has to do with sensor networks, with sensors, is black hole or gray hole, which is an intermediate type. So a black hole is about compromising a network node, a single one perhaps, and simply dropping all the packets or some of the packets in the case of gray hole when they are traveling through it. So if it's a sensor network, then there will be a sensor node that when it receives data from other sensors, it doesn't pass them on to their destination, but it simply drops them. So that's black hole, and if it drops some of them, it's gray hole. These types of attacks are very common, or very commonly studied at least, in the context of sensor networks, which of course are very relevant to cyber-physical attacks that have to do with integrity and availability, because either the information doesn't come in time, or the information never comes. So in this case, it affects I and A, integrity and availability, and from the physical impact perspective, it affects the integrity of actuation. It can delay actuation, or it can prevent altogether actuation. For example, if the information that is dropped is the actual control command. And another one is code injection. Code injection is about extending the intended operation of a computer program by introducing malicious instructions. The one that everyone knows is SQL injection, and example of that would be such an attack against the SCADA database. Defenses in this case can be some types of intrusion detection, integrity verification, so verifying that the code is the correct code, and another one, of course, is to eliminate completely the vulnerability, because they tend to exploit the vulnerabilities to achieve the injection of new code, especially buffer overflows. And let's see. So as for in terms of impact, this can affect certainly confidentiality and integrity, less so availability, and it can affect any type of, it can create any kind of physical impact. The complexity is between low and high depending on the existence of the vulnerability. Command injection then, this is about accessing a target control unit, for example an ECU, if it is CAN bus, or the network, and then executing a command with a malicious intent. So the code executed is not new, so it's not like code injection. There is no additional instruction in there, but instead it already exists, the command already exists, and it is triggered by sending the equivalent command, perhaps by capturing a message and sending that message, which we know contains the command. So in this way, we inject a new command in the system. It is used, for example, to reset or alter the settings of an RTU, of PLC, and the type of defense that you can have in there is anything that would make it more difficult to create your own command, to create your own packet if it's a network. So encryption will do that, and any kind of strong authentication so that the person will not be in the network in the first place. And in terms of the types of impact, it is integrity more than anything, because we inject new commands, and it can have any kind of physical impact. When you have a new command, you can ask it to do anything you want, from monitoring someone's video feed to perhaps starting actuation of something that was not meant to start. So any kind of physical impact. The complexity can be high, but again, it depends on the existence of vulnerabilities usually, or the lack of strong authentication. And communication jamming, so we're going through this in alphabetical order, by the way. So in communication jamming, this affects primarily availability. Jamming is mainly about availability, so it can affect any kind of unauthorized actuation, integrity of actuation, delay actuation. It can prevent actuation. So anything that has to do with preventing actuation or delaying it and so on. This can be done through availability attacks like communication jamming, and in this way it does not affect, of course, physical privacy. We cannot sniff information by simply jamming the communication. So one way to use this in the context of cyber-physical attacks is to jam the communications of a drone, and in this way force it to return to base, to enter such a mode. And there are different types of defenses for communication jamming. For example, detection of jamming, and there are types of techniques that are used in order to mitigate the effects of jamming, like frequency hopping and spread spectrum, or physically moving, because jamming has a range. So by physically moving to a different place, you are not anymore affected by the communication jamming. In general, jamming works by creating interference on the wireless signal. Denial of service is the equivalent of jamming, but done not by physically creating more energy, by physically creating interference, but by bombarding a network with large volumes of network traffic. Usually, there are other types. There are types of low volume denial of service, but we'll talk here about the more common ones, which is the high volume denial of service, where it is where some user has through authentication. Or by breaching any kind of authentication, has managed to be in the network, and by being in the network if they have the right to transmit, for example, by being a rogue ECU in the CAN bus network, then they send large amounts of traffic. The example from the CAN bus, from cars for CAN bus, is when a rogue ECU blocks every other ECU by flooding the CAN bus with high priority messages. So in this way, the other ECUs cannot send messages. And it can be defended in a number of ways. Authentication is one, so that this malicious user will not enter the network in the first place. Intrusion detection, which is about detecting that there is a denial of service. Firewalls, redundancy, having more networks or having more channels for communication can alleviate these problems. And denial of service, just like jamming, is about availability more than anything else, and as a result it affects actuation. It cannot affect physical privacy, at least not directly. Then we move on to false data injection, which can be of three types. Here we start with a communication-based false data injection. This is about compromising the communication channel or using any rogue node, for example, to do that, like in the rogue ECU example just above. And the point is to transmit false data. So it's not as much about flooding as we had just before, flooding the CAN bus with messages. They are false messages again, but the point is to flood the CAN bus rather than the actual message itself. In this case, the actual message is what matters. So it's about transmitting false data. And an example would be a rogue smart meter, which is reporting the false data, either for the user not to pay as much as they should, or to confuse the smart grid by creating a false sense about the current demand for energy. Defenses can be about detecting bad data. It can be about authenticating the messages, for example, through encryption. It can be through intrusion detection and so on, or replication. There are a number of different ways for these. I would say that false data injection is often seen as a type of false sensor data, and as such, it's bad data detection. So, for example, using other sensors or other mechanisms for measuring that information and seeing if the two mechanisms or more than one mechanisms agree with each other. So this is also a replication. You measure the same thing in two different ways, and if the two agree, then they're fine. If they don't, then you can start suspecting that there might be false data injection involved. So this is the communication based, when it is based on the network communication between, let's say, the sensor and the control unit. Or it can be based on the database. So it's not the communication, it's not when the information is communicated, but it is where the information is stored. So it's the database that is affected. Again, it's about integrity of the data. It's the database that is affected, and this can happen, for example, for the SCADA database, where someone might get into and then modify the data through the access that they have in the database. In this case, if it's database-based, then it's more about database security measures, and also, of course, about data replication over different locations, so that we know that the data are not stored in only one database, but in multiple. So if someone needs to, or if someone intends to breach the security of one database, well, they haven't breached the security of another database. So we can check between the two if the data agree. And it can be sensor-based. In this case, it is about compromising the sensor controller to report false data. So it's not the communication. It's not like the information did not travel correctly. It's not like the information was not stored correctly, but the information was not reported correctly from the sensor controller. So this happens if we have, let's say, a compromised RTU, compromised PLC perhaps, which is reporting false data to the SCADA master. And defense for this can again be detecting bad data. It's about having a redundancy of sensors or more than one replications, perhaps diversity, and so on. Again, it's about integrity more than anything, because it's about false data injection, which of course affects integrity. In terms of firmware modification, this can affect pretty much anything, but I would say the primary target is integrity, because it doesn't do what it is meant to do, and we can see it as a class of the code injection type of attacks, where it is rogue firmware that is loaded on an embedded system. So this can happen, for example, if a system allows updating its firmware through the internet, or generally allows updating its firmware, and then an attacker manages to inject or to create different firmware and replace the original one, perhaps on the database of the manufacturer. So then whoever installs it will install that rogue firmware, which will take control of a few things, and of course at the level of cyber impact it will affect integrity. As an example, a smart TV might be modified to record the image on a camera while the display is switched off. So it doesn't matter what the smart TV is doing, the camera is still there, and the firmware might be recording even if it doesn't look like it is on. So this is one of the first attacks that were shown for smart appliances, for smart devices in general, for smart TVs in specific, and they made quite an impression when they were first shown in a Black Hat conference, if I remember correctly. Defenses, this is more about verifying the integrity of the system, and also a type of defense that can be used is behavior specification intrusion detection, because when we have the original firmware, we expect a certain behavior. If the behavior is not according to the specification, then this is an indication that something suspicious has happened. So behavior specification IDS intrusion detection systems can do this. This, of course, is a very high complexity attack. And then there is fuzzing. Now, fuzzing is about bombarding the network with different packets and observing what they do. So if you don't know anything about how a network perhaps, or perhaps about the packets that are used in a network, the messages that are sent in a network in order to control different aspects of a system, let's say of a car, then you can bombard it with every possible packet and then see what each one does. By every possible packet, I mean every possible combination of zeros and ones, because a network packet is effectively not much more than a zeros and ones. So by sending all the different combinations, or many, we do what is called fuzzing, and fuzzing has been used, for example, for CAN bus to reveal for a particular car's CAN messages which ones they correspond to what. So which message is the one that, for example, might open the window. And defense for this tends to be different types of authentication, so making it difficult to be in the network and do fuzzing in the first place. And then there is GPS jamming, which just like communication jamming, after all it is a communication jamming type, it is about transmitting high power signals, so creating interference that will impede the reception of legitimate GPS signals. The real difference between communication jamming and GPS jamming is really in the frequency that might be used, which should be the frequency of GPS signals, and of course the impact, because the impact is of a GPS jammer is that it impairs the autonomous vehicle's navigation, it impairs the location that is shown on a car sat-nav, it impairs the location that is shown perhaps on a phone. So it's the impact, it's more about the ability of making the user think they are in the wrong place or heading to the wrong place that really makes a difference. And defense for this can be anti-jamming devices and jamming resilient GPS receivers. Now what that means, well, it depends on the type of technique used, but one technique that can be used is that one can measure, for example, the signal strength. If the signal strength of the supposedly legitimate GPS signal is very high, then that's unlikely to be legitimate, because the real signals, the legitimate GPS signals, come from satellites. So they come from very far away. They're weak signals. When they are received by a receiver, they are very weak signals. A signal that comes from a terrestrial, from something that is on Earth, will be much stronger. So you can tell from this side that it doesn't come from a satellite. So this is one of the techniques that can be used. There are many other types of techniques, but this is one of the techniques that can be used to tell whether a signal is legitimate or not. And GPS beaconing is beyond jamming, is actually capturing a GPS signal and rebroadcasting it with a slight delay. So in this case, it shows a slightly different location, and again, with the same logic, GPS spoofing, which is not only that it affects the accuracy of the location, but it chooses the location that it wants to send. So GPS spoofing is again about transmitting a false GPS signal so as to deceive the GPS receiver regarding the location or the time, which is the same thing in practice. And in this way, effectively steer it. So when this attack started appearing in the literature, in the academic literature, it was about perhaps 2013, maybe a bit earlier than that, when researchers started showing that it is possible to effectively steer a drone or a civilian at least, a drone, by jamming the original GPS signal and feeding it with fake GPS signals. Because if a drone thinks it is north of where it is meant to be, where it will travel south. And if it is south of where it was meant to be, then it will travel north. So in this way, a GPS spoofer, which I must say it's not a terribly easy thing to do. It can be done, of course, especially now with software-defined radio. It's not very easy, but it can be done. And it can lead to hijacking the steering, also actually controlling a vehicle that is autonomous, and if it is entirely based, of course, on GPS. Now, moving on to perhaps something much more general than these attacks are malware examples or malware attacks. Viruses in general, these are parasitic programs that infect other programs with malicious code and are activated only when users run these infected host programs. So this is a virus. A virus is something that spreads only with human action. So if it is in an email and we click on that email, if it is shared over a network, if it is carried in a USB stick and we click on that one, perhaps sometimes you don't even need to click on it. But in the context of cyber-physical attacks, one example would be the one by Nilsson and Larsson. That's back from 2008. That's a very old one, where the virus was very simple, a program that would send an unlock door message on the CAN bus every time it would detect a locked door message. Remember that in CAN bus, every message is read by everyone on the same CAN bus, on the same bus. So if an ECU that is a rogue ECU or an ECU that has an infected or a malicious firmware, if it receives a command, if it sees the message on the CAN bus being locked door, even if it is a completely irrelevant ECU, again, everyone receives every message in CAN bus, then that ECU might generate the message unlock door. So it will be just after lock door. So the door will be locked perhaps, but then it will be unlocked just after that. So effectively negating neutralizing the effect of the original message. So that would be a virus, or perhaps more accurately described as a logic bomb, because a logic bomb is a kind of virus that has a condition. The condition is if I detect a lock door message, and then based on that condition, it generates an action. So that's a logic bomb type of virus. And then worms, these are viruses that self-replicate. They don't need human action to do that, and they can infect other computers in the same network. They are automated in this sense, and by far the most famous of all is Stuxnet, which was, of course, a targeted worm, and less targeted would be this Slammer worm that affected every computer, many computers across the world, but including these, it would be a nuclear plant, and other malware that they're general purpose malware that tend to infect most of the times Microsoft Windows operating systems, and they also affect whatever system is also has the same operating system, even if it is, for example, a control system like a railway dispatching system and signaling system, or a medical piece of equipment. Then backdoors, these are also malware. They are the type of malware that allow unauthorized access to the systems that they are installed in, and many more. Now I have to apologize for the amount of text. Perhaps you can ignore it, just listen to me. So bots, the term can be used for two things. A bot can be a compromised computer, or the software that compromises a computer. So we use the term for both. And the compromised computers, they all form groups, which we call a botnet. So an example of a botnet attack that led to a cyber-physical attack was the 2001 Port of Houston denial of service attack. It was a botnet controlled by someone, by a teenager in that case, who ordered the botnet, so this network of bots, to do something at the same time, to launch an attack when activated by the attacker. The result was that the Port of Houston lost access to some very important information about the environmental conditions in the port. Or not the Port of Houston that lost the connection, it was the ships going in the Port of Houston that lost that access. Then rootkits, these are software tools that tend to conceal the presence of an adversary. So they can have different types of uses, but this is the most common. So this is about concealing the presence of the person who has broken into a system. And an example would be, again, Stuxnet, because Stuxnet carried the first ever rootkit that was designed specifically for PLCs, perhaps more generally for industrial control systems. And then keyloggers. Now, keyloggers, these are types of malware that record keystrokes. An example would be the keylogger that was found in machines of American drone operators in 2011. And Trojan horses, which are the types of malware that pretend to be useful software but have a hidden malicious payload, a hidden malicious function, for example a rootkit, or for example a keylogger in there. But they are actual software. They might be doing something. They might be measuring someone's, say, steps, but at the same time they might be recording the password of the person who has this mobile device. And an example would be, so as I said again, an example would be a Trojan horse smartphone app. In this case, I have another one. I have an app that uploads malicious code to the car's telematics unit through Bluetooth connection, and there is a paper from 2011 explaining about the use of this. Again, we are in, I remind you, we are in alphabetical order, so now we are in M, and man in the middle, perhaps the most common term in cyber-physical, in cyber attacks in general, and why not in cyber-physical too, can affect any type of, can create any kind of impact and any kind of physical impact, both cyber and physical. Then the complexity, I have it here classified as moderate. I think it is moderate, but it would not be inaccurate to say that it can be between low and high, depending on the complexity of the system involved. The man-in-the-middle attack is where the attacker connects independently with two computers, with two targets, let's say, and relays messages between them. So the point is that the two computers believe that they communicate directly and privately with each other, but they don't really. There is the attacker in between them who eavesdrop on the messages and can also inject or manipulate the messages. So effectively, there is no connection directly between them. They think they talk to each other, but they talk through the man in the middle. An example would be in a man-in-the-middle attack between the HMI, the human-machine interface, which is this one, and the data acquisition server. So if someone is in the middle, if there is the man in the middle in there, then the man in the middle can decide what information is sent to the HMI, which is the information that will be seen by the engineers in that industrial control facility. And from the HMI, there will be commands which will be hijacked by the man in the middle, and then the man in the middle will send different commands to the data acquisition server. So the man in the middle might be getting the data from the RTUs and PLCs himself, and then sending false data to the HMI. So this would be a type of man-in-the-middle attack in a SCADA context. The defense for this tends to be strong authentication and data integrity measures, so measuring that the data that we receive are indeed authentic and they are the correct data. Network isolation. Now this is kind of special type of case, a special case of attack. So here the attacks aim to isolate a particular physical geographical area from a network. So how this will happen? Well, it depends on the specifics of the system, of the network. But one way would be to have a black hole attack in the smart grid, where there might be targets that are chosen based on their geographical location rather than their location on the network. So by doing this, if someone affects, for example, with a black hole attack, the data in a specific, let's say, neighborhood, then that specific neighborhood will be isolated from the smart grid. So it is a type of, I have it as a special attack. I don't think it's a special attack necessarily, but from the perspective of physical impact, it has a specific target which is geographical rather than perhaps a more specific point, a more specific system. And again, now we move on from N to P and packet sniffing. Packet sniffing is about eavesdropping on messages. It is done perfectly legitimately in one's own network. So if you want to see how your network is operating, what kind of packets are transmitted, perhaps what kind of network is transmitted, it's perfectly legitimate to do packet sniffing. And there are many types of excellent pieces of software like Wireshark that do this. But of course, this, like every tool, can be abused too. And if one has access to unauthorized access, of course, to, let's say, SCADA network, then they can use Wireshark to start sniffing all those DNP3 packets that are sent from the RTUs to the master station. Defense against packet sniffing, the obvious one is encryption. Encryption makes it very difficult to read the messages that are sniffed, the messages that are eavesdropped on. So encryption is the standard approach for mitigating the effects of packet sniffing. I mean, the packets will still be sniffed, but it will not be obvious what they have inside because it will be encrypted. And they affect confidentiality more. Well, actually, only packet sniffing is only about confidentiality, and it can only affect physical privacy in this sense, in terms of physical impact. Then there is password cracking. Now, this is so general, I don't think there is anything specific about it in cyber-physical systems, but perhaps it is worth noting that one of the most common types of vulnerabilities in industrial control systems and in other types of critical cyber-physical systems and Internet of Things devices is that they use either very weak password policies or no password policies. So they might allow a password with only 3 characters, for example. So this is, the most important of aspect now when talking about password cracking in this sense, because it doesn't really differ significantly to any kind of cyber context, any kind of network or system. And just as is the case with most of these, two-factor authentication seems to do the trick, at least to a large extent, and having strong password policies tends to work well also. Now, the relay attack, this is when there is a proximity-based authentication system. So, for example, for a car, the proximity-based authentication system is one where it uses a low-range communication between the smart key, the car key, and the car, and that allows keyless entry. When it is within range, it assumes it is within 2 meters or so, because that's the range of this short-range communication. So if it is within range, then the owner is next to the car. So let's unlock the car. So that's the logic of keyless entry, or that's the main way of doing keyless entry. So when you have such proximity-based authentication, the way that attackers can overcome this is by creating a false sense to the car that it is closer to the owner than it thinks. So how do you do this? Well, if the way to assume the 2 meter distance, or the short distance anyway, is through the existence of network connection, well, let's create network connection. So let's relay the normal communication that was meant to send between the two through an extra wireless channel that 2 attackers create. So one is next to the car, the other is next to the owner, or next to the key, which is in the pocket of the owner, of course. And let's create a channel between them. And in this way, this information that comes from the key and is meant to go to the car, or from the car actually, and it's meant to go to the key. Well, it goes to the first attacker's wireless device, which is usually a software-defined radio device, and then that attacker sends it to the second one, to their accomplice, who will relay it to the owner. So now the information did indeed go from the car to the owner, The car gets then a response, because the response is a UHF usually. It's a longer range response. So if that happens, well, it knows that, or it thinks that it is next to the owner. Otherwise, how is it possible that I communicated with my owner? Since it was meant to be short-range communication, and it did in fact happen. The way to defend against such problems, which are actually becoming important problems, especially car thieves are using this. They buy such equipment and they use this to steal cars. So what the manufacturers can do is that they can introduce things like distance bounding. So distance bounding is about estimating the actual distance based on time. So how long did it take for this message to arrive? I did send it in short range. Yes, indeed, someone responded to me, but it took them longer than normal. So that's an indication that maybe we are not really within 2 meters distance. Perhaps it's a longer distance because it should have arrived earlier. So it's the time. So it's a strict time constraint that mitigates the effect, that prevents this from happening. And after relay, there is a replay attack. Now, in relay attack, it was a current communication sequence that is hijacked effectively, that is relayed through a channel. In replay attack, it is an old communication sequence. So one observes and records a communication sequence and then replays it later. So Stuxnet, what it did is that it recorded the sensor data that were measured, the values that were measured when the nuclear facilities controllers were fine, when the centrifuges were fine, and then replayed these sensor values when there was the attack happening. So Stuxnet would not be noticed by the operators of the nuclear facilities HMI, by the human machine interface, because they would see the old sensor data. So they would think that everything is fine, and it would be difficult to tell why there is so much damage increase in the centrifuges. It can be replaying the sensor data in this case, or it can be replaying actuation commands. So for example, it can be observing which command, which message corresponds to the command for operating an insulin pump, and then replay that message. One does not need to know what the message contains. All they need to know is that this is the message that is sent when, for example, we do this or we do that in terms of actuation. And defense for this, there are a number of different ones. I would say that a common one is to detect time discrepancies using random identifiers. So if the identifier changes all the time, if it expires in, let's say, 15 minutes, so then the replay attack needs to happen within 15 minutes. Otherwise, the old identifier will be noticed by the system, and the replay attack will be invalid. And there can be a rogue node then. Now again, rogue node is not really an attack by itself, but it is, let's say, a strategy or a name for an attacker. So in the rogue node, we have an attacker who perhaps introduces a new device, a new laptop, a new embedded system, anything that pretends to be a legitimate node in a network. So physically connecting a malicious device to an onboard diagnostics port of a car, for example, is one way to introduce a rogue node. And the most appropriate way for defending, at least starting a defense against the possibility of rogue nodes, is to have a strong authentication. So in a sense, and encryption, of course. So in a sense, prevent the rogue node from even existing, from entering and joining the network. So making it difficult for a node to be part of the network. We're now in S, so again, alphabetical order. This is S and sleep deprivation. So this is about exhausting the battery. So it's more about devices that rely on batteries, and they can be forced to never sleep. So there is a trust level. The device trusts that when someone sends a command, it's because they need to know something. So if someone, for example, sends a command to an implantable medical device, please give me the latest measurement for this or that, then there is a trust that the medical device is indeed needed by that user, that they actually need to see the value, the sensor value. But in reality, it might be someone who keeps doing this just so as to keep the implantable medical device busy, and by keeping it busy, exhaust its battery. So that's the point of sleep deprivation attack. It's about exhausting the battery by constantly performing an action, by constantly receiving, processing, or transmitting data. And a defense that I've seen in the academic literature working well is using behavior specification based intrusion detection systems, where it is the specification of the system that is not met. So by monitoring that the implantable medical device does indeed operate as often as is expected. If an implantable medical device needs to send traffic every second for the next 3 hours, well, this can be prevented by simply specifying that it cannot send, let's say, traffic every more than once every 5 minutes or something like this, or not more than 2 or 3 times in an hour. So in this way, it's the specification that prevents this from happening. So so we can do this with a behavior specification based intrusion detection, or at least it's the behavior specification that helps detect it if it not prevent it in this sense. In S now, supply chain attack. Now, supply chain attack is about any attack that involves modifying some system, some subsystem, often some equipment, some piece of some little chip perhaps inside a system at the level of the supply chain, so while it was being produced. So either where it is made in the actual factory that made it, or in the process of in the logistics process when it is moving from one place to another, when it is integrated perhaps in someone else's system, because no device nowadays is really made in one place. Most of them use different electronic devices created for different reasons in different places. So if one of them is compromised, or there is an insider in one of them, then there can be a supply chain attack there, which will affect anyone using this piece of equipment in their systems. So if a phone, for example, uses a sensor or a sensor that is, for whatever reason, any kind of sensor, and that sensor has been compromised at the level of its production, then it will affect any mobile phone or any manufacturer that uses this supplier of this sensor. And defense for supply chain attacks tends to be based on software integrity verification, so verifying that the software is indeed the way it was meant to be. And also there are non-technical ways like certifications, so security compliance certifications for suppliers, which exist in a few countries. And we'll finish with what is again not really an attack. It's more of a strategy of an attacker. It is something that is expected in the most advanced types of attacks, especially in advanced persistent threats. Now, advanced persistent threat tends to be a threat that comes from a nation state, from other very capable attackers, very capable groups, often of interdisciplinary groups of attackers, which have specific targets, they have time, they have money, and they can be persistent in a sense, so they are advanced persistent threats. So these types of advanced attackers, but not only, tend to use anti-forensics. So anti-forensics is the process of covering one's tracks. To cover one's tracks, of course, in cyberspace means eliminating traces of the attack left. It means deleting files which were created during the attack. It means hiding things, like using steganography in order to hide data in seemingly innocuous files, like in images. So an image might look like an image and indeed be an image, but also it might be including inside that image hidden information, hidden data. So that's steganography. It might be about temporarily disabling logs. So there might be a log being kept in a system, but while there is the attacker, this advanced attacker in there, they might temporarily disable them so that no trace is recorded of them, or remove or change lines in these logs. It might be about waiting. So this is in fact used often by APTs, which stay dormant for very long periods of time. For instance, Stuxnet 0.5, the original version, or one of the original versions of Stuxnet, not the one that actually worked in a sense. That Stuxnet was using a 20-day period before forcing a reboot to the system. So it is infecting someone, it is infected in computer, but doesn't do anything for 20 days. At that point, it forces a reboot by generating what we used to call at least, a blue screen of death in Windows, which forces the user of this Windows machine to reboot it. So it's not that like Stuxnet did the reboot, but it forced the user to reboot the system, and that happened 20 days later. So in this sense, there is this sense of less automation. There is this sense that it probably isn't malware because it didn't do anything for a long time. We didn't see anything happening. No one inserted, let's say, a USB stick in this machine, or the last time someone inserted a USB stick in this machine was 20 days ago. So it can't be malware because it doesn't happen very often. But systems like advanced persistent threats, APTs, such types of malware, they tend to use such techniques which effectively deceive the user into thinking that there is no threat, perhaps, by waiting. So it's this staying in a dormant state, in waiting, that helps in anti-forensics. And at the network level, it's about deleting network logs again. It's about using address spoofing, so pretending to be from a different place, from different network IP, by using bots. So rather than the user being the person, the individual user that connects directly, it might be a bot that does that. It might be doing it at a later point in time. So again, we have both time and different IP source, using proxy servers, and of course using encryption, which of course when something is encrypted, it is very difficult to tell what is inside there. So anti-forensics is a type of strategy that is expected by very advanced threats.